time is okay. With the first step, I think I would ask Mr. Herman Pirchner, Ambassador Herbst, and Mr. Gridin to come to the dais, because our first session will immediately commence after just a couple of words and advertisement from the local sponsor. Right. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 20th annual Ukraine's Quest for Mature Nation Statehood Roundtable, devoted this year to defining the abiding priorities for Ukraine's national security doctrine. I've had the privilege. Can someone close the door here? Yes. We can hear the back noise. I've had the privilege of being the events program coordinator. Today I will have the honor of being the events host moderator. As host moderator, I've traditionally taken a very short time to explain basically the why, that is why we're here, and the how we will proceed of our gathering before turning to the opening remarks session, the key session. This year, I will use part of that why session to simply salute or toast the event and the series that it's part of. Because literally 20 years ago, in 1999, the signal came from Ukraine, both from the executive and legislative side of the government, that Ukraine had Euro-Atlantic ambitions, wanted stronger ties with the EU, deeper ties with NATO, more fulsome ties with US and Canada. Friends of Ukraine, both in the US NGO community and in the Ukrainian American community, immediately took note. Several of them, in fact, are posted here in front of us. That is the US-Ukraine Foundation, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the Foreign Policy Council, and eventually the Center for US-Ukrainian Relations, which was created out of that consortium. All of them came together and decided, after having taken note, that they would explore this signal more closely. And that decision led to a near singular event, a forum for the ages, featuring the likes of Zbig Brzezinski and Paul Wolfowitz, Karl Levin and Mitch McConnell, Paula Dobyanska and Bill Taylor, who's now serving as senior diplomat in Ukraine today, Boris Tarashuk and Oleksiy, and followed in train by a veritable who's who of the Washington foreign policy think tankers following in train. Some of those who helped organize that event are with us today. Nadia is here. We will see Morgan at some point. We have Andrei Dobyansky here from UCCA. These were major players 20 years ago. We are here now, 20 years later, with this process. It was an important process. Some of those who helped organize understood that the gathering itself had been so successful that it ought to have an encore. And so the organizers decided to do exactly that. In fact, they did more than that. They established the Quest as a series of conferences that would monitor or become the monitoring mechanism for Ukraine's professed ambitions to draw closer, if not likely join the Euro-Atlantic community. The mechanism managed to thrive and grow in the midst of some rather important historical events both in the US and Ukraine. Those that were organizers remember that we literally had to move, as a result of 9/11, we had to move the conference from one moment in time to another moment in time, and everybody agreed to do that. A month later, Roundtable 5, where John McCain as a featured keynote, occurred at the doorstep of the Orange Revolution. In fact, the series itself became so popular that it began to do spin-offs, doing particular aspects of Ukraine's maturation. Security dialogues, the US-Ukraine security dialogue, US-Ukraine energy dialogue, business networking series, things done in conjunction with the US Business Council and with US-Ukraine Foundation. A Ukraine historical encounters series that dealt with Ukraine's history with its neighbors and even with itself. So throughout the first decade, 2000 to 2010, the exploration done remained optimistic despite occasional setbacks, including Gazagate, Chuvagate, Election-gate during right before Orange. But the topics always seem to be the same, that is overarching, strategic, dealing with the national interests, something that Ukraine would have to do one way or another, whoever was in politics. The situational or the political was left out of the picture. So when we did these trilogies of these conferences, we would do US-Ukraine strategic partnership, or US-Ukraine NATO, Ukraine EU, or if we did the internal, it would be Ukraine's quest for established national identity, Ukraine's quest for a market economy, Ukraine's quest for developed democracy, all in the sort of Euro-Atlantic ambition situation. 2010, 2014 proved to be different. For the first time, there was some serious doubt raised whether Ukraine would remain committed to the Euro-Atlantic pact. The Sevastopol Basin for 25 years that was granted to Putin. The no to NATO. The slowdown on EU accession. The suppression of internal dissent, even jailing political opponents, the market turning increasingly into a really very corrupt place, having made real serious advances the years before. So the Roundtable actually turned the situation. Our Roundtable actually turned the situation when we created these report cards that we did for 2-3 years in a row, where we decided to monitor whether Ukraine was actually regressing from the Euro-Atlantic ambition. And we eventually decided, and we know what the outcome was, that 2014 gave us the Maidan, and 2014 also gave us a new democratic regime, one that was again committed to the Euro-Atlantic. We kept the report card, but we kept it not because the Ukrainians were internally destabilized, but because there was a war. There was occupation of Ukrainian lands. So we split. We had the Roundtable series and we did the report cards. The report cards in June and the Roundtable series in October. 2016 to 2018, that period we dealt with a trilogy dealing with internal cohesion, about how national minorities are treated, how religious minorities are treated, and about class and gender cohesion in the society. So we get to today, and why we're here today. In a sentence or two, what we decided to do at that time, for this last trilogy, is national security. But again, at an overarching level rather than situational. Last year, we dealt with the material sources of the Ukrainian military. This year, we were about to do the personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces. But we decided to switch, because next year we were going to do the doctrine question, what we're doing this year. But with a new president, a new parliament, we decided that we'll flip it. We really do need to look at the issue of national security and national security doctrine, given that we have a new political dynamic in Ukraine. Now, it's democratically elected like never before, because the characters that have come into office certainly have done done in Ukraine in a credibly democratic fashion. But the question is now, is this new democratically elected government and parliament ready to step up to the Euro-Atlantic ambitions? We'll be exploring some of that today. And that's basically, and exploring the overarching issues of national security, regardless of who's involved. And so with that, sorry that I took as much time as I did, but I thought that it would put context to what we are going to be attempting to do. And I padded the conference so much in terms of time that I think we can afford to lose a few minutes. That's why I started a little late, because I wanted to make sure that all the players were in. We were supposed to have today, the theme of the highlight session was Ukraine needs to properly defend itself, with view from the Ukrainian government, with Ms. Alina Frollo, Deputy Minister of Ukraine, if you might look at the conference. She was not able to make it. So what we did is we actually found two alternative speakers, both of whom are quite capable of dealing with this issue. And so, with no, as they say, no further ado, I would like to pass it on. I remind everyone that in this first session, we will give, we're looking at, we're dividing that 20-minute remarks into 10, 15 minutes apiece for each of our two speakers. And in the next sessions, the how, I should have said something about the how. In the sessions that follow, we will be giving the speakers, the moderators, 10 minutes, the speakers 20 minutes apiece, and then we have enough time, because this time we created the time, we have enough time for a good 20, 30 minutes of discussion in each of the panels. So with that, Herman, I'm really sorry that it took as much time as it did. I think we're off to the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you for the good memories you brought forth in discussing the conferences that happened in previous years. And of course, none of this good work would have been possible without you being the linchpin and the main organizer, and I think everybody appreciates that and owes Walter a round of applause for that. Our first speaker today is Ambassador John Herbst. He's had a really storied diplomatic career, serving in multiple senior posts in Israel and Saudi Arabia and Russia. He went on, of course, to be ambassador to both Uzbekistan and Ukraine. Coming out of his ambassadorship in Ukraine, he became director of the National Defense University's Center for Complex Operations, and now serves as the director for Eurasia at the Atlantic Council of the United States. Anybody following Ukraine has read his thoughtful articles and heard his thoughtful presentations, and I look forward to hearing another one today. I turn the floor over to John.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. When Walter asked me to speak, he talked about my addressing the Ukraine national security doctrine, which of course is being revised. And so I'll speak briefly to this point and then speak more broadly about Ukraine's security. Ukraine, under former President Poroshenko, developed a defense doctrine which properly focused on the Kremlin threat, because that was, and that remains, the principal, certainly external danger facing Ukraine. But every military planner and every strategist knows that strategies and plans are useful for clarifying thought, establishing relations, but ultimately they fly out the window as things develop, because any practical policy has to respond to events on the ground and rejigger itself in order to deal with the challenge. And I think it's safe to say that Poroshenko deserves a lot of credit. He and his team deserve a lot of credit for stabilizing Ukraine's defenses in the first weeks of his presidency and taking back a good share of the Donbass in the summer of 2014, before the Red Army came in without any subterfuge and defeated Ukrainian forces at Ilovaisk. Now, fast forward to today, you have a new Vice Minister for Transatlantic Relations, Mr. Kuleba, and under his aegis, Ukraine is revising its national security strategy. It hasn't appeared yet. He was in Brussels in September, talking about it, gathering their thoughts, so that Ukraine can refocus. And that happens with every new administration, and that's a good thing. And one hopes, I hope, that as this new strategy is put together, it will reflect, and I suspect it will, the very good experience Ukraine has accrued in essentially fighting the Kremlin to a standstill in the East. Those who follow the war closely and follow Ukraine's defense posture closely know that the Ukrainian military in 2014 had a very Soviet air, top-heavy, generals who had been taught about exchanges of nuclear missiles, taught about tanks crossing the Fulda Gap. And of course, we all know that in 2014, sadly, Ukraine was surprised and not at all ready for Kremlin aggression, first in Crimea and then in Donbass. And we know, too, that the credible defense that Ukraine mounted starting in early June of 2014 was the result not just of a great national elan, which was critical for nation formation in Ukraine, and we all know that a lot of the best fighting was done by Ukrainian Russian speakers coming from the East. But we also know that the best commanders were at the captain, major, lieutenant colonel level. And we know as well that a fair amount of those lower level officers have moved up and are now assuming command positions. I think that one thing that we are seeing, and we'll see more of under President Zelensky, is empowering those folks. And we also know, of course, that U.S. military has learned a great deal from their Ukrainian counterparts, who at this point have more information, more knowledge, more expertise than anyone in the whole world at fighting the Kremlin in a hybrid war. And that is very valuable information. Having said that, and having addressed the national security strategy part of my remarks, I just want to turn to the broader issues that are facing both Ukraine, the United States, actually not both, Ukraine, the United States, and the West today. To repeat, Ukraine to date has fought the world's second most powerful military to a draw. Now that's partly because the world's second most powerful military has not been entirely deployed. And that, of course, is related to the strong but not strong enough reaction of the United States and the West to the Kremlin's aggression in Ukraine. The success Ukraine has, the success Ukraine has had on the battlefield is due partly to the support it has received from the West. While senior Russian officials may claim that sanctions have no impact on them, it's not going to change their policies, and of course sanctions have not prompted the Russians to get out of Donbass, it's also true that the sanctions are costing the Russian economy 1 to 1.5% of GDP a year. And senior Russian economic officials have acknowledged that, as has the IMF. You do that for 5 straight years, and that adds up to real money, compound interest. We also know that the standard of living in Russia has dropped at a higher rate than the minuscule drop, the small drop in GDP. If you follow Russia carefully, you know that the people sanctioned by the West, Putin's pals, large economic actors, have been partly, if not completely, reimbursed by the Kremlin at the expense of the average Russian. And this is not a secret. So sanctions have hurt the Kremlin economy, and Moscow would like to avoid more sanctions. And they've been bitterly disappointed by the fact that the sanctions have been renewed every single time. And I know there's a tendency among some of my Ukrainian friends to always see black when things are not quite black. So I'm pointing out to you that this summer, which saw the unfortunate return of Russia to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, also saw the EU move its sanctions policies from renewing it every 6 months to renewing it every year. In other words, that's an effective toughening of sanctions. So that's one, the sanctions. And of course, two, is the military assistance that the West, and especially the United States, has given. We know that javelins have removed the tanks as a Russian offensive weapon because Moscow does not want Russian soldiers dying and returning to Russia, because that underscores the fact that the Russian people don't want the war. So this support from the West has been critical. And the reason why I'm telling you this, because you already know it, is because we have a very difficult and a very strange period right now. We have this thing called an impeachment inquiry going on Capitol Hill. And the immediate cause of this impeachment hearing was the peculiar diplomacy of the American president in regard to Ukraine. And the information that became public suggesting that, one, President Trump was holding up a summit with Zelensky, and two, and on this there's evidence there, but it's not quite as strong, that he was withholding military assistance that Congress had voted and that his administration had approved in order to persuade President Zelensky to do an investigation into Vice President Biden, as well as looking into Ukraine's participation, you might say, use a neutral word, in the 2016 American presidential election. And that prompted the impeachment inquiry. I'm now speaking as strictly a foreign policy guy, not as an American citizen, although my foreign policy interests are determined by American interests. And from the standpoint of our foreign policy interests in Russia and Ukraine, the impeachment inquiry is a complicating factor. Because the approximate cause of it, the military aid withholding, had actually been fixed before the impeachment inquiry was announced. And once the impeachment inquiry was announced, you were going to see, and we've seen, a drawing of strong bipartisan lines as each party defends what it believes to be its party interests. And this has made Ukraine a political issue in the United States in ways that it was not before. That's very dangerous because Ukraine needs bipartisan support from the United States. At the present time, despite what I've just said, that bipartisan support remains strong. President Trump released his hold on Ukrainian military aid, not just because the Democrats were conducting investigations in the House where they had a majority, but because Republican senators were pounding him privately. It's important, again, that both parties be able to support Ukraine and not have American politics get in the way. If, in order to please President Trump, President Zelensky goes down an investigation road, he will anger the Democrats. And that will be very dangerous for him. Yet, for him to simply say no to Trump suggests another danger. I'm not certain how this plays out, but it's important for all people who understand Americans' interest in a strong Ukraine and America's interest in combating an aggressive Kremlin that we maintain support for Ukraine in Donbass. That is critical for American interests. And for those of us in this audience who are in the Ukrainian American community, this should be uppermost in their mind as they look at their political activity in this country. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Oleksiy Gridin. Since November 2015, he's been the acting head of the Volunteer Council of the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine. And that council coordinates efforts of more than 35 public and volunteer organizations involved in national security measures. And I think everybody in this room is aware of the vital role they played, especially after the invasion of Donbass. Oleksiy, we look forward to hearing your comments.
Доброго дня. Дякую організаторам за запрошення і можливість виступу. Про національну доктрину безпеки, безпекову доктрину я мало що можу сказати, тому що вона розробляється зараз і на ній працюють фахівці. І вона буде явно не така, як є зараз. Я би більше хотів, ви мене питали за ситуацію, яка склалася у нас на Донбасі, і про розведення військ, і про деокупацію, або варіанти розвитку, які є, які розглядає Офіс Президента, які можливі наслідки. Ну, по-перше, на сьогодні розглядається два варіанти. Перший варіант – це варіант, коли все буде йти за планом, коли буде знайдено компромісне рішення, коли розведуться війська, коли перестануть стріляти. І згідно мінських домовленостей і формули Штайнмаєра будуть проводитися дії, які приведуть к фактичній деокупації. Але всі в Офісі Президента і розуміють, що це варіант мало обнадійливий, і розглядається інший варіант. Інший варіант – це, якщо не спрацює перший варіант, буде варіант стіна. Але експерти і фахівці розуміють, що не перший, не другий варіант не є реальними, вони будуть всі компромісними, і буде якийсь компромісний варіант, якщо ми не прийдемо к варіанту агресії зі сторони Росії, якщо ми не зможемо домовитися. Що другий варіант, який є, який фахівці і військові спеціалісти оцінюють, і в тому числі з нашого інституту, Українського інституту безпекових досліджень, як все ж таки найбільш реальний, для того, щоб його ймовірність була мінімальна, необхідно зробити деякі шаги. І ці кроки, вони доволі ефективні. Ці кроки є продумані фахівцями інституту, і вони запропоновані були на розгляд керівництва держави і керівництва Міністерства оборони. Я хочу на них зупинитися і більш детальніше сказати. Ну, по-перше, необхідно реалізувати 4 або 5 державних програм. Їх можна реалізувати за 2-3 роки. Зокрема, мова про необхідність пріоритетних, які дозволять наступним 2-3 роками істотно підвищити бойовий потенціал держави. Державна програма номер 1 – це вдосконалення системи управління. Вона повинна включати створення єдиної автоматизованої системи управління Збройних сил, а в подальшому і всіх сил оборони. Державна програма номер 2 – це розвиток і створення сучасних систем радіоелектронної розвідки. радіоелектронної боротьби, сучасних систем виявлення, наведення на цілі і засоби придушення електронних сигналів. Державна програма номер 3 – це розвиток системи протиповітряної оборони. Аналіз військових загроз свідчить про постійне нарощування Росією потенціалу для введення проти України масштабної війни 4-го покоління і вище. Тому саме ефективний опір атакам з повітря може забезпечити відмову агресора від такої моделі війни. Державна програма номер 4 – це розвиток високоточних засобів ураження. Це найважливіша складова ракетного щита стримування. Державна програма номер 5 – це розвиток безекіпажних платформ і робототехніки. Аналіз сучасних тенденцій розвитку армії свідчить про акценти на створення бойових безекіпажних платформ різних видів та сучасних бойових роботів з різними функціями. Ще хотів би декілька слів. Виконання цих 5 програм, або 3, або 4 в різний час їх виконання може привести до того, що потенційна агресія Російської Федерації до України може бути зменшена до такого рівня, коли ймовірні наслідки їхньої людських втрат буде більше, ніж досягнути цілі. Зараз головним управлінням розвідки Міністерства оборони України прораховано 8 варіантів ймовірних сценаріїв розвитку ситуації воєнного характеру в середній та довгостроковій перспективі. Військовим фахівцям було зазначено, що 4 з 8 прогнозованих воєнних сценаріїв передбачають реальний захист суверенітету та територіальної цілісності України. Найбільш небезпечним з точки зору фахівців є сценарій збройного конфлікту всередині України, який буде підготовлено та спровоковано ззовні з метою зміни державного устрою та конституційного ладу або для зміни військово-політичного керівництва. Другим за небезпечністю є сценарій повномасштабного застосування Росією воєнної сили проти України. Третім за рівнем небезпечності є втягнення України в збройний конфлікт інших держав. Четвертим – прикордонний збройний конфлікт, який по суті стане лише причиною для проведення проти України масштабної воєнної операції. Треба зазначити, що Міністерство оборони України вже приступило до створення об'єднаної оперативної концепції застосування збройних сил за цими сценаріями. Треба констатувати, що за останні 5 років Збройні сили України не підготували не готові для реагування на такі сценарії, як повномасштабне вторгнення. Тобто у нас немає таких сил і можливості захистити себе при повномасштабному вторгненні. Тому реалізація такої програми може приведе до мінімізації ризиків за такими сценаріями. На закінчення хочу сказати, що все вище сказане можна і треба реалізовувати в тісній кооперації та в стратегічному партнерстві з США. Нам необхідна допомога як з обміном досвідом, так і розширення військового технічного співробітництва. Дякую за увагу.
We have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Who wants to start?
Thank you so much. My name is Mariana Bujarin. I'm a research fellow at the Herman Kennedy School. Mr. Gridin. Я запитаюся українською тоді. Очевидно, як ви зазначили, що Україна не має наразі військових можливостей захистити себе в цьому сценарії, якщо Росія розвертає повномасштабну агресію проти України. Питання стоїть, чи при найкращих зусиллях України колись буде така ситуація, що Україна зможе протистояти такій агресії, зважаючи на те, що Україна має з другого боку кордону, так? Все-таки друга найбільша армія світу, так? Якщо її повністю мобілізувати, мабуть, за найкращих обставин буде важко стримати агресію. Чи розглядається Міністерством оборони України питання не тільки оборони, але й стримування, стратегічного стримування? Зараз розпався договір про РСМД, який забороняв балістичні ракети певної дальності. Чи розглядається Міністерством оборони варіант відновлення або запуску таких ракет в звичайному оснащенні, але які би могли бути націлені на стратегічність цілі Російської Федерації? Дякую.
На перше питання. Ми розуміємо, що дві радянські армії виграє та, яка більше. Тому ми говоримо про те, що відповіді повинні бути асиметричні, технологічні, повинні бути найбільші зусилля докладені на розвиток нових сучасних видів озброєння, технологічних видів зброї, які мають, можливо, навіть інші фізичні свойства. Якості. Ці питання підіймаються. Зараз ми з інститутом, з Національним інститутом стратегічних досліджень розробляємо концепцію створення інноваційної платформи при Міністерстві оборони. Міністр оборони, ми з ним спілкувалися, є попередній так, і я маю надію, що це питання буде вирішено. І це надасть можливість на цій платформі комплексно дивитися на розвиток в частині озброєння подальше. На друге питання, відповідно, так, розглядається таке питання. Наскільки воно буде реалізовано, це питання? Знаю, що роботи йдуть по цьому питанню, але по більш радіусом меншим, чим ви назвали. І, мабуть, це все, що я можу сказати зараз. Але це питання розглядається.
Hi, my name is Oleksiy. I'm from the Ukrainian English language newspaper, the Kyiv Post. I've got a quick question for Mr. Gridin and another for Ambassador Herbst. But Mr. Gridin, he mentioned the possibility of Ukraine being drawn into a conflict with foreign countries. I just wanted him to explain what he meant by that. And for Ambassador Herbst, who touched upon the possible dangers of bipartisan support for Ukraine being subject to party political pressures because of this imbroglio Trump, Biden, Zelensky. How does he suggest what actions could Ukraine take to minimize being further sucked into this domestic American situation, political situation, and limit any damage to corrosion of bipartisan support? Thank you.
На це питання це сценарії, які розроблені головним управлінням розвідки. Мало того, ці сценарії були розроблені з допомогою програм, які використовують штучний інтелект. Ці програми є доволі, можна сказати, що вони реальні, да, ці прогнози. В якому форматі буде реалізований цей сценарій, мені трудно відповісти, бо цей річ йде про приграничні країни, які розглядалися як можливий конфлікт і участь України як однієї з сторін.
I think that it's very important for President Zelensky to realize that he should avoid any step which greatly annoys either Democrats or Republicans. Easier said than done. Easier said than done. I know that he received advice to this effect, especially in the late spring, when a certain honorable former mayor wanted to go to Ukraine. It's not illegitimate to do investigations into whether or not Ukraine was involved in our 2016 election. Because there was at least one credible story about that. As far as I can tell, there have been no credible stories about Vice President Biden going after a prosecutor in order to protect a company or his son in Ukraine. Because all experts on Ukraine, domestic and foreign, understood the prosecutor in question was not a reformer and was not going after that company. So the Ukrainians need to reach out to both Republicans and Democrats, and they need to recognize, and I think they do, that the Republicans consist both of the executive branch and the legislative branch. And they've always had strong friends in the legislative branch in both parties, and they need to work very hard to maintain that.
I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question. We all know that the Ukrainian armed forces understand what they're fighting for and are motivated to do so. I'd be curious what both Oleksiy and John think about the motivation of Russian forces. Are they willing to fight, to die? Is the Russian political system prepared to accept the type of losses they would have if they invaded further Ukraine?
I think we know with great evidence that the war in Donbass is a Kremlin war, not a Russian war in Ukraine. Polls have shown for years now, Levada Center polls, which is the premier polling outfit in Russia, have shown for years that the Russian people do not want their soldiers fighting in Ukraine. And the Kremlin has gone to great lengths to hide, first and foremost from its own people, the fact that they are sending regular officers to run the fight in Ukraine. That there are at least a couple of thousand Russian officers directing operations in Donbass. That's why Russian casualties are hidden from the public. And while, of course, the casualties are acknowledged to the relatives are admonished not to talk about it. And we know as well that major casualties are a political problem for Putin. That's why I'm skeptical that he would actually send Russian forces in an open way and take the hundreds, if not thousands, of KIAs that would result from such an action, because the Ukrainians will fight. They've demonstrated that. And they have some weapons that would be able to inflict real casualties. Their great vulnerability, as Mr. Gridin noted, is from the air. But of course, once the Russian Air Force is in play, it's hard for them to say, well, these are just planes that somehow the quote-unquote separatists stole from Ukrainian forces. So that's why I don't think that will happen. You can't exclude it though.
Я би сказав, моральний дух українських воїнів. За останній рік він вже не такий високий, який був раніше. Дуже багато є звільнень, дуже багато звільнень висококласних бойових офіцерів, багато бажаючих звільнитися. Я маю надію, що програма, яку презентував міністр оборони, яка є пунктом людиноцентричної армії, коли йдеться про соціальну підтримку, мотивацію, розвиток як солдатів, офіцерів, сержантського складу. Я маю надію, що ця програма буде реалізована і це надасть додаткову мотивацію військовослужбовцям боронити і виходити служити в українських військах.
But if Ukraine were further invaded, what would the motivation be?
Якби було повномасштабне? Ну так. Будемо говорити так, що українські військові, вони патріотичні. І ми розуміємо, що якщо буде повноцінне вторгнення, то підніметься вся нація. І не тільки військові будуть воювати. Я не бачу стимулів для росіян або російських військових, крім комерційних або якихось там ідеологічних, імперіалістичних. Ну, я не думаю, що це великий такий пріоритет на патріотичності українців.
Join me in thanking both the panelists. Thank you.